Hello, and welcome to CBTS Tech Talk. I am your producer, Lance Hart, and today we're going to be talking about 3 critical goals for application modernization initiatives. That's a handful, but I was able to get through it. Anyway, our experts today are Justin Rice, Chief Solution Architect, and John Lloyd, Global Solutions Architect. Welcome, guys.
Welcome. Thank you.
And
thank you, Lance.
we have a really special guest today, Bill Martorelli from Forrester. He's a principal analyst at Forrester. Anyway,
nice to be with you.
Yeah, thank you for joining. And Justin, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And John and Bill, thank you for coming and spending time with us today. What we're going to talk about today are different areas that organizations need to consider when they're going through or starting their modernization journey, specifically around applications, right? So I want to talk through today the goals of modernization, the different modernization approaches. I want to talk through some different constraints and benefits. And frankly, we have a pretty big list here. And over the next 30 minutes, we're going to see how far we can go. But before we get started here, let's do a couple of rounds of introductions. John, tell me, who are you, where are you from, and what do you do?
Yeah, so John Lloyd, I work for CBTS, been here about 12 years. I have a focus on really helping our strategic customers, large enterprise customers, tie together what used to be siloed, right? So applications, platforms, operations. How do those 3 things really work together? So in the past, those used to be 3 very distinct silos. And I think a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about with Bill here today is really how that's all kind of been mashed into one strategic combined focus. And so I help our customers, our organizations align and strategize around tying those 3 A, P, and O's together.
Yeah, good. And you have a University of Cincinnati book next to me. Are you from Cincinnati? Where are you from?
I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and I moved, proud alumni of University of Cincinnati. So moved here a long time ago, went to school, and started a family here.
Fantastic. All right, Bill, your turn. Who are you? Where are you from? And what do you do?
Okay, I'm Bill Martorelli with Forrester Research. Been here a real long time. Won't tell you how long, but it's been about 20 years now. And I cover a variety of things, and I help clients, a lot with their cloud strategies, including modernization, migration to the cloud. Originally from New Jersey, now in Fairfield County, Connecticut.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks again for being here, Bill and John. I want to start off today with the definition of app modernization. That seems to be a pretty broad topic. So, John, let's start with you. How would you define app modernization?
So there's like this super technical, like literal definition, right? Of like updating legacy software to work in new frameworks or new languages or new architectures, new homes, right? The cloud, for example. Then there's the actual business impact and where I try to define it when I talk with organizations, which is taking legacy workloads, legacy software, legacy applications in your network, in your environment, in your data center, and really looking at how are they being interacted with today by your end user, by your customer, by your employee. Really, what are the goals? Why did you write that application? Why did you buy that application? What was it originally doing when you put it in? What do you need it to do better? And so for me, modernization isn't just about the literal definition of making it more, writing it in a new language or making it cloud native. It's about adjusting and reforming, refactoring, replacing, whatever you want. We'll get to all that. Making your applications achieve a new job or achieve a new function for your business than maybe when you first put it in.
I like the business outcome piece of that equation. Bill, what do you think?
I tend to agree with what he said. I think that, modernization can take a lot of different forms, right? But properly speaking, I think you should differentiate something that's being modernized from something that's being built entirely new, right? But in many ways, people do interpret it that way, right? Building entire new things that could be, the face of modernization. But we tend to think about it from, let's say, improving, retrofitting, whatever things that have already existed and putting them in a new form, again, ultimately for greater business value, not just for the hell of it.
Yeah, totally agree. So let's talk through then. You're a CIO in his organization. You have to put forth in front of your board what the goals of modernization are going to be. Now, when I read the Forrester research, it said, hey, there's 3 goals. I have modernized experience, I have increased adaptability, and I have add new functionality and reduce risk. Those are the three goals. Can you talk through, Bill, with us, can you further elaborate on what those three goals really mean?
Well, I mean, I think, that they make a good deal of sense. I mean, I'll start in the middle with the question about adaptability. Ultimately, the role of modernization is to allow the enterprise to become or maintain competitiveness in a very fast-paced and rapidly changing market. I mean, you can argue that part of the reason, of course, also is to reduce technical debt, to kind of gain a new, fresh footing, right, and not be as burdened, from past implementation or efforts as we were in the past. And ultimately, that could also result in other benefits like saving money and the like. But I think that it really does have to have a multi, varied approach, and seeking those three benefits in some, in some combination, I think would be the goal of any real modernization effort.
Okay. John, you have anything to add there?
Well, I think Bill hit on, I agree with adaptability, because I think adaptability of those three things is probably the most versatile. You can kind of change it to mean other things. I always look at it as adaptability into other applications, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do I start to look at, in general, right? Mergers and acquisitions. We see a lot of times organizations that have acquired, maybe it's a competitor, or to take them into a new footprint geographically, a new territory. How can I adapt how they were doing business into what I'm doing? Or how do I start to integrate maybe my application that was around a CRM needs to be integrated to my contact center now? Like, how do I adapt an application that was maybe built in a legacy language sitting on a server in my data center, maybe in a dead language? How do I start to adopt and adapt into what's coming next? So I think
so interesting. I'm actually going to interrupt you, John, because you hit something here. Like, one of those goals being also modernizing the experience.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is you're actually, with the adaptability piece, you're kind of checking that box too. Whether that's an experience for your employees or experience for your customers, that adaptability helps serve that purpose.
Well, I think too, when you say experience, right? Like what everything is across the globe, what we've been through for the last 3 years, like understanding geographical location, geographical freedom. When that application is static to a physical building, right? That's a huge difference. I think the number one complaint that most organizations got out of, sending everybody home and saying, hey, you can go work from anywhere is, it's slow, it's not working. That end user experience as well. So yes, it's how do I make your job easier? How do I make applications, more productive? A centralized hub. That's a common theme we're seeing.
Yeah.
How do I have a centralized hub that I can plug multiple applications into for this end user experience? But I think also geographical, GeoIP, load balancing, things like that, making the application live closer to me, and me changes, right, where I live.
Yeah. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I think, I agree. I think we might have given short shrift to the whole modernization of experience, and that's really central to it, right? To improve the customer experience, even the employee experience, which is an increasing goal of a lot of enterprise customers of ours. So that's absolutely essential. We think that, cloud native at the end of the day is really all about creating these new kinds of business ecosystems that improve customer obsession and, allow people to build business models that with the customer at the center. And that's really all about CX.
Well, let's talk. I'm going to stick with you, Bill. Talk about, how reducing risk comes into this equation. Obviously, that's important. Like, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, the longer you let something go and the longer you become dependent on legacy languages, legacy platforms, right? Even legacy skill sets, I suppose, even though a lot of them are in increasing demand, you really do run the risk of either, running yourself into a bit of a dead end. We've had examples of this, right? Where customers that are seeking to migrate to the cloud and modernize really kind of stuck because there's no immediate or easily available analog, if you will, or alternative for them in the cloud. And so they face a very lengthy and potentially very costly modernization effort, and I think it's also a matter of business risk too, because if you fail to modernize, you really risk falling behind other competitors that have caught up. I don't want to overstate this, but on the other hand, it is true that if other companies can achieve greater levels of agility, greater release frequencies, right? Introduce new features and functions to attract, retain customers, you're going to be at a disadvantage. So I think that's a key part of the whole modernization equation is to, reduce competitive risk.
And I think too, so Bill, you hit on it, right? I kind of put these in two different buckets, which is, I mean, there's a lot of buckets, but the two specifically I'm talking about here is what is the application to your end customer or to your employee. And so when you start talking about reducing risk, Bill hit on these skill sets. There's legacy applications, there's legacy languages that are maybe harder to find. Well, now I got to pay more, right? For people that speak, can write in Cobalt or things like that. But also, even for the modern languages, those organizations, these SaaS organizations, that competitive pay scale right now, which is, in my opinion, is completely unsustainable over the next 18 to 24 months. But we see a lot of companies are sitting there saying, I need these skill sets, and there are these giant SaaS companies in the world that are way overpaying what a normal organization can. And so I tend to look at, from what is intellectual property, what is it that I need to be able to iterate on my own schedule? Is this application revenue generating? Is this how my customers interact with me? Is this how I gain revenue from my customer? I'll use Uber as an example, right? Like that specific application, yes, it needs to iterate, and it's got to keep up with Lyft, and it's got to keep up with user CX demand and feedback, and it's got to keep up with safety and all of these things. But I'm sure there's other applications that Uber runs on that aren't customer facing that they may take a completely different approach to, right? And so I kind of put them in those buckets, or what do we need to do ourselves to have complete control, and what are the things that, rather than trying to pay with the scale right now, it's insane what kind of the job market is demanding for a lot of different reasons and factors. Maybe I just go buy it off the shelf. And I think SaaS doesn't necessarily get the credence, because it kind of seems like the easy button in that modernization. But I think the business landscape is really pushing more and more SaaS.
Yeah, I think
I agree with you on that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, same here. That actually gives us a really good opportunity to move to the next section here, which is the different approaches to modernizing your application. So we hear this, you can read it all over the internet, and Forrester does a really good job of defining this, is there's different decision points that exist when you go to modernize. You have your replatform, you have modernize and then move, you have move and then modernize, there's the move to SaaS that you just explained, and then just a complete rebuild of the application. So how do you navigate those decision points? You know that they exist with multiple stakeholders within an organization. How do you decide what is the right starting point?
I would say I would say ultimately it's a workload by workload decision, right? I mean, you can find this list of replatform, modernize, then move, et cetera, sort of an equivalent to what you may have heard of in terms of the 6 R's or whatever you may be more familiar with, but it's essentially the same, right? And we find that even though we like to think, for example, that maybe the great era of lift and shift is over, which we take as somewhat equivalent to replatforming. Like in the old days, we'd moved from Unix to Linux. Now, of course, it's usually to the cloud, right? And so that's all well and good, and that we would be moving more into an age of modernization. But in reality, all of these remain viable and important solutions for customers, and they typically will coexist within the large enterprise, again, on a workload by workload basis. We talked about SaaS a little bit, right? SaaS is great if you can find a replacement for your custom built applications, but you can't find SaaS for everything, right? And so in practice, it's really going to be you're going to be involved in all of these things, and it's choosing how and when and where is really the art of it.
I think, so Bill, we always use, I completely agree, we call it app rationalization, right? Looking at it workload by workload and going, it could be what's driving it. It could be financial. So maybe you look at it and say, what is the impact? What's the effort of the lift? How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost me? What's my return on that investment? And right now, positive ROI projects are certainly getting approved. Ones that don't have a positive ROI, maybe it's a little more convincing needed. But then you also look at, maybe it's not cost, maybe it's impact to the business. What is the thing that we need to do to our end customer, to our employee, who might be our end customer, depending on where you sit in the organization. So really looking workload by workload, as Bill said, what is the effort? What is the impact? What is the timeline? And I think when we talk with organizations, they tend to find some low-hanging fruit that they can kind of use to start to to maybe get first downs or prove small successes to the business.
Yeah, that's very, very important, by the way. You know, you look at a modernization effort, it can easily take you a year, 18 months, and sustaining that enthusiasm is really an important aspect of this. And just one more point about the replatforming lift and shift. You know, it's easy to say, and we hear it all the time. You know, a lot of vendors will tell you this, you know, lift and shift has no real business value. But then at the end of the day, you know, you can be event driven. If you have to close a data center, you got a colo contract running out, you know, I mean, that's real value, right? You know, closing a DC and evading those facilities costs or escaping and getting rid of contracts. So, you know, it really is hard to make really doctrinaire judgments about this that are sweeping in nature. So you really have to go workload at a time.
Well, question. So, Bill, you mentioned, you know, sustaining enthusiasm being a critical part of this whole strategy, right? I think through the pandemic, a lot of us are a lot more, have a lot lower tolerance for fatigue, it seems like. So understanding an app strategy has to have your cloud team, your app team, your infrastructure team. How do you get folks from different parts of the organization excited for a long time to execute a strategy like this?
So I think the first thing is when you talk about bringing together different parts of the organization, it's understanding that what is the impact, right? And so how does the what's in it for me sort of statement, right, that sales used to use, I think IT looks at. What is the benefit for me? The days of when Bill talked about, you know, it can take 18 months and environments can change. 2017, maybe it was starting to fade by 2018, but the idea was cloud first. You talk to global enterprise, we're cloud first. We're cloud first. And then it kind of, well, we're cloud first when it makes sense, right? And now we started to see those budgets, and then now, you know, COVID obviously changed the way people think about things. So I think, how do you get everybody in alignment? It's understanding the shared vision and the shared goal. Is it, you know, SaaS isn't a thing for everyone, right? You can't always have it, but maybe you can start with SaaS and do low code on top of it. So what's in it for me as the developer is maybe getting the core and then just working on the customization or the intellectual property that's for us. What's in it for me in the data center team is maybe reducing the amount of applications that I have to make sure the lights are on for and you know, get the phone call at midnight. What's in it for me as the network team is, again, not having to build the redundancies into my network because, you know, these CDNs, the cloud distribution networks, Azure WAN, things like that kind of take some of that out of it. So I think for me, how do you gain alignment is every group needs to have a voice, but really focus it. What is the benefit on modernizing this app? What's the business impact? What is the cost impact? What's the network impact? And really that helps kind of drive towards that end state.
Yeah, I think giving everybody a voice makes a lot of sense because I think you get consensus in a lot quicker fashion, right? People are excited about moving forward if they all have some input into the process. Bill, what do you think?
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think that, you know, I wouldn't want to trivialize the skills challenges, the talent acquisition, retention challenges, or even technical challenges. But I hear, you know, a lot of the time, at the end of the day, people tell me it's really about organizational change management and, you know, management of expectations, explanation of benefits, right? It can be difficult to articulate in advance, right? The benefits of a migration and or modernization effort in terms that business really will find compelling. So I think that's a really big part of it.
Yeah. Well, you know, we've kind of shifted a little bit into the constraint topic. And John, you mentioned kind of the cost to value assessment that you have to do. Tell me about, I kind of want to, as a constraint, double click on the risk topic, specifically risk on business operations. So that seems to be a common constraint to not modernize an application because of the sheer disruption it may cause to the business. How do you jump that hurdle?
Well, so obviously dev environments are everybody's best friend, right? So how do I start to understand how, you know, we always start with app dependency mapping, right? Understanding not just what about this application, but where does it tie in and what else will break, right? There's nothing better, you know, nothing worse than when you think you fix a problem and you create 3 more and now you spend, you know, the next 12 months trying to fix that. So the first, I would say, start with a plan of application mapping and understanding what's tied together. Start with a development, you know, your dev environment to understand how it's going to perform at wherever its end state is, whether that's a different platform in your data center, whether that's moving to bare metal on the clouds like a VMC on AWS or an AVS or a cloud native, right? Understand you can build that out ahead of time. Yeah. I still think that's where you kind of come back to waterfall sort of methodology of going step by step through your development and programming. But that is kind of, when you talk about risk, we want it now. We want it now. We want you to develop.
Like an agile.
Yes, we want this new feature in 2 weeks, not in 6 weeks. And so that's really where you see the advent of how do I minimize that risk, and that's where you see containerization and microservices and starting to reduce the default domains and the failure points and things like that. There's always going to be some risk, but what's the risk of keeping the status quo? What's the risk of doing nothing? What's the risk of that application failing and you not having the same backup, or not being able to patch it because it doesn't live in HA and you can't take it down without creating a massive outage, or that hardware failing? So to me, the risk of doing nothing is it becomes harder to continue to modernize it. The further behind you get, the more work, because you can't go from A to Z. You got to go A to B to C. So I think there's more risk there. You can put plans in place, especially with the right partners, that help you test, develop, and ensure before you go live that things aren't going to break. To me, doing nothing is the greatest risk, because you just fall further and further behind.
Yeah. Okay. Bill, what do you think?
I would agree. I think it's sort of it does kind of compound with time, right? Like interest in a way, even though, of course, current interest rates are relatively low. But I mean, it really does. And I think it does constrain, it can constrain options as you go forward. So yeah, modernization is an important thing, but it costs money too. So it obviously has to be, phased in a way that makes sense economically and can be justified, relevant to business terms. So, it's a challenge, I think, to sequence the activities effectively.
Well, it's interesting. One thing I've observed is the evolution of talent as technology has changed does not keep up with the rate of change of technology, right? It's always kind of a laggard. So how do you give confidence or gain confidence even of the delivery process of an application modernization strategy when, frankly, like a lot of times, it may be new to everybody involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously where, like CBTS, like really great for us and organizations like us, which is, it is becoming increasing, especially, this was even before the job market, through COVID and through work from anywhere and inflation and all of the things that are creating these constraints and these challenges. You used to have your key players, right? You had the networking company, the route switch company, you had the voice company, you had, right? There was one or two. The competition now, it's great. I mean, it's capitalism, it's free enterprise, and it's allowing organizations to choose purpose-built applications or choose whatever language they want to write in. So one, I would tell you, being able to partner with somebody that's there for the long haul, you can sub in people, right? And it be an extension of your team, an extension of your organization. That I think is critical. Also looking at kind of more standardization across languages is starting to become more and more prevalent, so that there is kind of this skill set that is a little bit more uniform. But Bill's hit on it a few times. This is an 18-month project, a 24-month project. You're going to have changes in that team. And I think that's where, between the cost to hire developers, the cost to retain talent, to train new talent, having somebody like a CBTS be able to partner along with you is critical, because that way you don't lose efforts. You just can continue that CI/CD pipeline and continue running your apps through it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, that's a good way, I think, from the confidence standpoint. You rely on the partner community is, I guess, that tenant, that anchor, right, for you to help you through that process. But Bill, do you have anything to add around how do you gain confidence through the delivery process?
Well, I mean, I think that it's very important, as we said, to kind of set it up in the right way. Do your best in terms of anticipating challenges. There's a number of different established techniques out there in terms of methodologies, whether you're talking about, methods like SAFe or, using patterns like the Strangler pattern and the like. I mean, these things are pretty well known and pretty well established. I think that, you hit on something very important. I thought the idea of using external service companies. I mean, and I'm not trying to be a cheerleader for them. I've worked a lot with them, of course. I won't deny that. But, a lot of times people have real needs to help get a kickstart, right, and really get moving. And sometimes external services can really help you in that regard, to help you really sequence an effort and get it off of square one. People do talk about this, though, and I've heard this. It's kind of a thing recently, a meme, if you will. People say, well, if I use external service providers, maybe then I'll, wind up without skills of my own. But what does it really help you if you can't hire or retain them in the first place? And so it really has been I think, a really obvious and persistent demand for assistance in these migration and modernization efforts. And I think that can help build that confidence you speak about.
And I think so, Bill. Exactly what you hit on. One of the things I think we try to do is to be a Lego piece and fit in it where at the right spot. And for a lot of organizations, it is getting that initial 6 months. It's building, deciding what are the tools we're going to use, what are the languages, where's it going to live, like kind of putting that strategy in place, building that pipeline, running 2, 3, 4 applications through it with an organization's team, right?
Yep.
Helping their newly minted team. A lot of times we're seeing them pull somebody from the security team because we don't want to lose security focus, pulling somebody from the networking team, hiring young developers out of college. We don't take this kind of prescriptive, here's our methodology, it's our way or the highway. And I think a lot of times some of our competitors in this space say, this is how we do app modernization, take it or leave it, and you're going to fit to it. We take a much more tailored approach. And so I think you can solve some of those challenges of, if I start with an outside company, I'm reliant on an outside company, and that's not the way that we approach it. We approach it with helping you build it, helping get your feet under you, helping train your folks, and then you call it, those first 6 months could be 70-80% of the work done, and now your team has responsibility for seeing it through the rest of your application portfolio.
Yeah, it's interesting, and kind of I'm going to wrap this up with a couple comments, and I'm going to pause for questions, but what we've heard over the last 26 minutes has been interesting, because we started with, okay, here's some goals around application modernization. And what you both touched on was the business value that the application brings, right? And that business value is derived from either internal processes, let's say, or revenue generating. Yep. And then, John, you talked through the dependencies, right? So let's look at the dependencies from compute, network, storage. What does the application talk to run effectively? That branch gets wider, and then you wrapped it around with risk and security. So we've talked about application modernization, but it's been interesting to watch this evolution of this conversation go from the business value all the way through to concluding kind of with risk. That's a darn big project.
Yeah.
Like that's interesting. So with that said, I do want to pause. Lance, our producer, did we have any questions come in through this, the last few minutes or so?
Yeah, give me 1 second here. I think we might have something coming in, so go ahead and continue, and I'll get back with you.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, John and Bill, kind of open it up to you guys with one final statement prior to getting into the questions. And John, I'll go with you first.
So what I would say is, advice-wise from applications, it's certainly, I would say, obviously a buzzword topic, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't have the same white papers behind it. And so, we appreciate partnerships like, organizations like Forrester that are providing some guidance, but it's newer. It's not the same 20 years of kind of networking expertise, right? There's a lot of things changing
very rapidly,
incredibly rapidly. Yeah. And so there's not a right answer. If somebody's tuned in today to say, oh, I hope we get the right answer. We don't have that. There is no right answer. We started off with saying it's workload by workload. You can expand that to say it's company by company. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the key takeaway is, what are your business outcomes? What are you trying to accomplish? And find a partner, internally or externally, that is willing to work towards that, coming to the table with your needs in mind, your ideas, and how they help you achieve them, rather than some prescriptive, step-by-step process you're going to follow.
That's a good point. Now, it does look like we have questions.
Yeah, guys, one that came in, how about estimating and determining the budget?
Yeah, Bill, why don't you start with that one?
Well, that's a good one. I mean, obviously, there's a fair amount of work out there and established practice on the subject of software cost estimation and what it would take to affect change in a modernization kind of capacity. I think, though, that when you think about replatforming to the cloud, sometimes that gets a little tricky, because you start having to think about things like choice of appropriate instance type and maybe using technology that you're not totally familiar with, right? So those things can complicate it a little bit. So, I mean, to me, there's also the subject has really shifted from a classic approach to software estimation and budgeting to more of a flexible, agile type of budgeting, right? In lieu of, the new kinds of development based on teaming structures like product teams, platform teams, in which it's very difficult to know the outcome in advance, and it's also very difficult to budget with precision in advance without using some effort-based metrics. So I would look at some of the work we've done on flexible budgeting by colleague Margot Visitation, and look into that and see how that can help you.
Thanks, Bill. What else do we have, Lance?
Yeah, I've got another one here. With the rapidly changing economic environment, are companies changing their modernization priorities?
Yeah, John.
So it depends, right? It comes back to, is the application revenue generating for you? Comes back to that app rationalization. I think the platform strategy is maybe changing more than the modernization strategy, which is kind of what I say in 2017 and 18 was cloud first. Well, maybe it's not anymore, but maybe we still like the idea of a consumption model, but in our environment. And so we're seeing OEM manufacturers in the data center space, instead of just selling a server, kind of selling gray cores or an operational model that allows you to grow. We run our own private and public cloud environment here. We have data centers across North America that we connect, we build compute farms into. And we started that in 2008. And I would tell you, we saw a great dip, obviously, with Azure and AWS, and that we can't keep up. I mean, that's growing gangbusters. People are starting to come back and looking at still the benefit of the cloud, but maybe not the big mass conglomerate cloud, something they can have more control over, more flexibility, more access to. So I would say the platforms are which people are looking at a little differently versus, I mean, if you don't have the budget, you don't have the budget. But I think people are really not just saying, well, we shouldn't prioritize modernizing or spending on it, but going, what is the smartest way to do it?
Yeah. We'll still make it, maybe cloud ready, right? We'll still go through the modernization. We'll look at things like, serverless or containers or whatever, make it easy to move to whatever the platform of the future is. But guess what? Right now, I have a little bit more platform flexibility.
Yeah. I think it's more focused on the platform than should we or shouldn't we budget wise.
Yep. Okay. We're out of time, guys.
Well, we have one more.
Oh, we have one more.
Yeah,
all right.
one more was somebody said they would love for you to expand on the mapping process.
Oh, yeah, John. So you've been going through that recently.
Yeah. So there obviously are software tools that kind of go out and call them crawlers that will go in the network. There's different, I don't want to necessarily talk about OEM tools, but they're will help you kind of understand where do the applications, what ports they connect on, what are the size of those links, right? And so when we start talking about mapping, let's start with a simple kind of at-time idea. I've got an application that lives on a server. It's got a certain amount of compute memory storage. It's got a 40 gig backbone that connects it into the core switch, that also in that same core switch is some server running a database on it, and that database has its own NIC network card in it that's got its own processors. It's a 7-core blah 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 blah, right?
That then talks to a web server.
Correct.
Yes.
And that's where it does its database dips and what speed it does those database dips. Well, now all of a sudden I moved that application to the cloud. Well, now how's that connecting? I've got a 20 by 20 dedicated internet link from ISP A. Well, I just said we had a 40 gig backbone over a layer 1 into a switch that's now coming over a 20 meg internet that's 12 hops between, right? That's an idea as we expand upon it. How we go about doing it is really think of them as LLDP type technologies, understanding, going out and sending out automated calls. We let those run typically 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and get this set of data. And then we have data scientists and engineers that come back and will review those findings and present data's only as useful as the form it's presented in, right? Structured data, presentable data, and help you understand what is the impact. A lot of times it does come down to how chatty the application is, how old the database, like DB2 dependencies, or maybe you've got SMBv2, like some old chatty applications that require you to be very near it and very well connected. Whereas like when you talk about cloud computing or serverless, things like that, they don't have those same dependencies.
Yep. Yeah, good. Lance, we do have one more question, it seems. Can you hit us with it?
Yes. It says, shouldn't business resilience of the application service be a priority? VNDR, BCP, et cetera.
Yeah. Bill, why don't you take that one?
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, that's certainly true. And I think that, that coupled with an improved experience are two of the major considerations we think. It's particularly poignant or relevant, I guess you could say, in the wake of some of the outages we've seen in the cloud and SaaS, and the question of how to, let's say, enhance resilience through, let's say, multi-cloud strategies is certainly something that is very top of mind for a lot of our clients these days. But yeah, you're right. Without a question, that's one of the major considerations of any modernization effort.
And I think to add on to that, Bill, this is where I kind of started out with what my focus is here is how we tie applications, platforms, operations, because the platform becomes important too. Bill meant multi-cloud, right? That's the platform we're talking about. So yes, we want that application to be resilient. We want to worry about DR. Okay, well, if I've got that virtualized running on a VM in my data center, I can also put it in Azure on AVS, and I can put it in on VMC on AWS, and I can put this bare metal stuff into these hyperscalers into the cloud. I think the key, though, right, and why I say these things are so tied together is that the right platform? Or do we start with application modernization? I can make it resilient. It's not as cost effective. I'm going to spend a lot more money, but I can make it more resilient, maybe without necessarily modernizing it. So
that's kind of where my mind was, John, was resiliency, frankly, is one of those things that you have to prioritize on a workload basis. Yeah. I may be okay that certain application workloads and all the compute resources that sit behind that, maybe it's okay to not be resilient.
Yeah, maybe those are mainframe, right? So maybe you can't change the platform. To be clear, I'm not saying it's only about platform. I'm just saying that's kind of the conversation that we have with customers is resiliency in DR is a perfect example of how you cannot decouple application from platform.
Yeah. Lance, looks like they're rapid fire over
We're
here.
in extra innings. I love it.
Yeah, we've got two more questions, and we're going to end on those two questions, folks, because we're already over on time. The first one is, how do you see an enterprise navigate through the multitude of CN tech stack and decide for themselves to navigate? Do you see any set of industry standards emerge in every aspect of CN dev?
Yeah, Bill, why don't you answer that from the analyst perspective?
We lost your audio, Bill.
Sorry about that. When you talk about cloud native development, you do see. I don't think you see a lot at this point. Obviously, the cloud native foundation. There's certainly work underway in that regard, but right now, you see an environment where there's little in the way of real standards, and de facto standards are emerging in the form of the different individual hyperscaler stacks, the multi-cloud container orchestration platforms. I think companies are really being forced now to kind of navigate through that now that they've reached a certain level of maturity in their cloud efforts. And increasingly it's sort of a real question as to where companies will go next, right? Directly to the cloud native in the form of hyperscaler specific, Kubernetes stacks, or it seems to me that at the moment they're going, almost simultaneously in both directions, and in the lieu of real, appropriate de facto standards. So, I really think that companies need to kind of organize this for themselves. A lot of it will depend on what cloud platform you're already using. A lot of that is driven by economic considerations as well as technical considerations. But I think if you're looking for real cloud native standardization, you're going to be waiting for a little while yet to come.
I would agree, and I think we see the same time in automation too. If you ask somebody what are the tool sets you use for automation, you're going to get 7 different things. And networking uses something different than security, et cetera. But I do start to see. I'm glad you mentioned that, Bill, because I think from the Forrester standpoint adds a lot more credence. I would have said the same thing. I would add we're starting to see, I don't want to say standardization, but maybe consensus on some of the tools to manage this. So you mentioned Kubernetes, and so you're starting to see more, do we use KubeNet, do we use Tanzu, things like that, Red Hat, what are they doing? You're starting to see, around, infrastructure as code, Hashi's kind of becoming hey, for networking, it's infrastructure as code, but it's Red Hat Ansible to build on top of that. It's you're starting to see some, what I would say is more management tools, more sort of than languages. And I think some of the cloud native providers are maybe influencing what is the standard. So I would tell you in the enterprise, enjoy those arguments, because that's really kind of what they are is arguments, and people have their vested interest.
All right, thanks, guys.
And a real problem too.
Yeah.
No, I think that there can be some interesting arguments. So watch out for that, right? I mean, there are entrenched interests that may prefer to go one way versus another, and I think that I think underscores the importance of organizational change management. Let's put it that way.
And the last question here we want to answer is, where do you see emergence of domain-specific industry clouds, such as financial services cloud, retail cloud, et cetera?
So I know from our side, we see a lot of, that with high trust, GDPR for the EU, high trust in the US. We see, GovCloud, are you FIPS certified, and Fed on-ramp and all of that. there's a GCC high in the Azure environment. Here's how I would put it. What we typically see isn't necessarily that they are vertical or industry specific cloud as much as vertical or industry specific certification, meaning maybe it's a little bit separated. I mean, it's no different. We've been doing it. You know, healthcare has been in there, and HIPAA is obviously a stringent thing. And these are PCI, SSAE 16 through 18 or whatever we're on now. I don't think it's any different than the colo days. I'd love your take on it, Bill. But for me, it's simply kind of creating separation of church and state, creating VERFs that separate them out logically, and then meeting the auditory requirements of it.
It definitely seems like to be this certification requirement, like you mentioned, and then kind of just a general like architecture requirement is where a lot of the vertical industries seem to go.
I can tell you, a lot of the customers I talk to, well, are you this today? Are you? I mentioned GCC high. Do you do that today? Like, if you want us to. There's a process we have to go through. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily, to me, it's more of, I don't want to say it's not important, but it's more sales fodder to put a stamp on and say, we went through the effort of getting this cert. It's the same as in the networking space. You were this network certified, or you were a gold partner versus a silver partner. But anyway, that's my take on it, is that it's much more about just being willing to go through the audit process, pay the fee for it, do the work for it, and keep those up to date every year. Bill, your thoughts?
I thought you said it very well, John. I think that's absolutely correct. Very insightful. And I do think, though, that, there is an important vertical industry element to modernization, though, that we're seeing, in the form of like accelerators that service companies are building, and also increasingly now the hyperscalers themselves, which kind of points to I don't know if it's not really a disintermediation, but it's certainly a realignment of roles, right? Traditional roles that the GSIs versus the hyperscalers have had. So that'll be interesting to watch. But there is, a lot of importance to the vertical element of modernization, if not necessarily in the form of vertical clouds per se.
Yep. All right. Well, that wraps up our questions. We did go over on time, but that is a great thing to happen and very engaging. So thank you all. Bill, thank you so much for spending time with us today. John, thank you for coming in.
Of course.
And until the next Tech Talk, we will see you all later.
So long.